Thank you very much indeed. First of all, again, thanks for being able to take part in this discussion. It's been very rich, and I have listened intently, and I've been inspired a couple of times, and I've sighed deeply a couple of times as well. The fact of the matter is, and I want to take up Michael's point about the value of international law and its importance. It's certainly true that over the past 70 years there has been the construction of a really important human rights structure, which, as a post-war consensus, we hoped has been able to deliver protections of fundamental human rights. But I think he's too optimistic. And I think there's a certain naivety about believing that more laws and the existing laws, and I do agree with him that the existing laws are adequate. I do believe that's right. Certainly from my perspective, I see that. But where I think the naivety is in believing that almost naturally the political will be found to actually transform the neglect and negligence of democratic countries over their responsibility to enforce international law into suddenly a new mood of willing enforcement and enthusiasm to do so. I speak on behalf of journalists who, over the past many years, understand very well that the protections they're offered through the Geneva Conventions and recently the numerous resolutions that have been adopted by the United Nations is not worth much in reality. The fact of the matter is that in the past year we have seen 130 journalists and media workers, many of them targeted and deliberately killed on the spot in Gaza. We've had 224 human rights defenders or humanitarian aid workers, also some of them targeted and killed. And the application of international law to protect them has not entered at all. There are 6 cases of targeted killings and assassination of journalists which are going to be going to the International Criminal Court. That's welcome. But there is no prospect that that is going to deliver the sort of justice that is necessary. But the fact of the matter is, for journalists in particular, the situation it finds itself, we found ourselves in Israel and Gaza now is not new, by no means. For decades, Israel has been killing journalists and media staff with impunity. A report by the Committee to Protect Journalists last year revealed that in the last 2 decades, 20 journalists have died at the hands of the Israeli Defense Force with no accountability, complete impunity. So the targeting and killing of journalists, which we've seen in recent months, really makes it very, very clear that these are crimes of war that need to be addressed. But there's a second problem here. And it's not just the individual and personal tragedies of journalists and their families who are the victims of this abuse of international human rights. It's also the full frontal attack on the right of the people to know what is going on in the region, not just in the region, but internationally. The fact that Israel has imposed effectively a blockade on the international media community in their ability to get into Gaza. The fact that they mount consistently disinformation campaigns whenever they are called to account. All of this indicates that the war against information, which is seeking to explain what's going on, to give background and to tell people, to give them some sort of glimmer of hope that they are being fed information that they can trust, is not on Israel's agenda at all. So I think that these issues are extremely important. We have international law, we have the Geneva Conventions, we have the mechanisms in place, but they are not enforced. And I think the point that Jeff makes about the transactional nature of rights being available is an important one. The fact of the matter is, where have the successes been in the application of international law in recent years? Inevitably, they have been in Africa. They have been in the Western Balkans. We have seen international justice, certainly regarding information and communications, being applied. But we are not seeing the international community, particularly the democratic community, willing to call Israel to account. And this is important The difference between Israel and other countries in the region is that Israel, on the moral high ground, calls itself a democracy and demands to be taken seriously as a democracy. And so therefore it has a special responsibility to try to defend those principles of democracy that are under attack. And yet we see Israel in practice and in effect calling into question the democratic principles and being abusive in their work. I just want to finally deal with a question which you put to us, Lisa, which is the question of what on earth can we do about all this? It's a good question. I think a lot of people feel powerless in the face of what's going on. And it's certainly true. There's not much that individuals can do. But one of the most important strengths that we have in civil society, both nationally and internationally, are the networks that we are part of. We as journalists are part of international networks of journalists. And what we do is we work together to protest and defend and promote the interests of journalists. There are international networks of teachers, of lawyers, of doctors, of workers, of people who have common interests from country to country, who cross borders and who can actually work with each other. It's really important, it seems to me, for us to get away from this sense of powerlessness, to use our networks to register our opinions, to call for action, both politically at the national level, but importantly, internationally. If that happens, and if it's done effectively, then I think that the, let's say, the optimistic position that Michael puts, we could see coming nearer. But I think the most important thing to do is to move away from this sense of powerlessness and to get back into thinking that there are things we can do and to come up with an agenda for change which we can put before our politicians and call on them to act. Thank you very much.